So just to go over basically the invitation to talk about his personal / intellectual biography, as well as his work and how he sees the relationship of sociology and social justice, and then to have discussion. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. When I taught this course, which means that I inevitably entered into the picture without explicitly trying to do so, which meant that I did not actually think about my relationship to social justice in terms of my own background, in terms of my agenda, aside from the material and aside from the degree to which it entered into the picture as me facilitating the material and early on in the semester. And the main emphasis that I placed on thinking about social justice in the seminar was on the contradictory nature of modern society, and the fact that there are lots of values that are supposed to inform and inspire our actions, all sorts of assumptions about what's real in modern society, and then there's the reality of modern society, which doesn't really fit too well with those assumptions about shared values and modes of conduct, etc. And so I essentially played the role of enabling the students to confront, this is one of my pet themes, cognitive dissonance. Basically, modern society is a context in which cognitive dissonance is a perpetual experience. We cannot possibly go through life without constantly experiencing cognitive dissonance. This is something that's directly hooked into the way modern society emerged and the way it works. And so as sociologists, or as social scientists in particular, it's necessary to acquire the ability to confront cognitive dissonance without freaking out. And so the background for that is that we are not really trained in any way to deal with cognitive dissonance. We are not trained to recognize cognitive dissonance, and we're definitely not trained to develop strategies of how to deal with it, which means that we, in a sense, are conditioned to respond to the experience of cognitive dissonance, of something not fitting together in terms of what reality is supposed to be like and what it actually is like, in ways that actually are part of a feedback loop with that contradictory reality. And so we're essentially conditioned to replicate the patterns that cause cognitive dissonance to begin with. And and this is where my biography will come in a moment. If there's this ability to deal with cognitive dissonance without freaking out or without sort of just denying it, without trying not to think about it, is not part of the educational agenda, if it's not one of the priorities of education in modern society, then when do people actually acquire this ability? And having taught now for 18 years at the grad and undergrad level, in the US mostly, a bit in Europe too. One of the lessons I learned from teaching classes, and sociology in particular, is that to an overwhelming majority of students, the idea that one can recognize cognitive dissonance for what it is, and then position oneself in relation to this experience of cognitive dissonance is not something that most of the students were acquainted with. It's rather something quite unheard of. And if they are exposed to it at all, it usually happens in grad school. So, which means that there's education, elementary, middle school, high school, college, where there's the fact that modern society is fraught with contradictions, and that there is this ubiquity of experiences of cognitive dissonance it's not part of the educational agenda. It's not part of the skills that we're supposed to acquire. It's something that we're basically something with regard to which we are left to our own devices, so to speak. So it's up to us, to each of us, how we deal with it. And so that's the social fact, so to speak, in a Durkheimian sense, that has to be recognized for what it is. And just to give you one very simple example, this is from a student I had, a PhD student I had in Florida, who was studying religion in the Department of Religion there. If you know anyone here, for example, who is in religion, people who study religion usually are almost exclusively interested in the socially constructed nature of religion. They are not religious. To most of them, it wouldn't actually occur to be religious, because religion is something that's an artifact of historical change. And so they want to figure out how this artifact came about, how it works, why people need it, for what kinds of purposes, why so many people subscribe to it, how there are differences between societies. Some societies of the same type, so if you look at modern societies, for example, appear to be significantly more religious than others. And so I had this one student who was a pretty smart guy from California, who had decided to write his dissertation on the history of Protestantism, on Calvin, in particular, one of the founders of Protestantism, one of the promoters, so to speak, of the Reformation. Calvin was his name. He was from Geneva in Switzerland. And so he had been working on this dissertation for a while. Students in religion and the religion department there had to take the theory courses in sociology if they were part of a program within religion. It was called Ethics and Society. And so it was not a requirement for all religion students, but students in that particular program had to take classical and contemporary sociological theory. And he, at least in terms of how he described it himself, experienced the greatest shock, or the greatest awakening in his life when he found out that there was this book written by Max Weber called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And so he had gotten his, already when he was working on his BA, he had developed an interest in religion, and his master's was in religion, and his PhD was to be in religion too. He also was at the same time an Episcopalian minister. And so he was able to go through all of this without ever coming across one of the founding texts of sociology. So as soon as he came across the Protestant ethic, his dissertation took on a completely different orientation. And I don't know whether his dissertation supervisor, who definitely knew the Protestant ethic, was upset about that or not, but the dissertation looked very different, the project looked very different after he had taken classical theory than it did before. And so this is just one very microcosmic, so to speak, example of the discrepancy between how we go through life and what is necessary in order for us to understand a particular dimension of social reality. And so I figured, since part of the assignment has been just to look at our own biography, which is not something I do habitually, I thought about this a bit over the last few days, and I initially thought, oh, there's really not much to talk about in terms of my biography. It's all pretty straight. I mean, I entered kindergarten when I was 3, i.e. the educational system, and I never left. And so it's a pretty straightforward story. But what I realized in the process is that there are obviously, quite obviously, huge differences between processes of identity formation in different societies. And in the time that I've been here at UT, and this has been now more than 7 years, I've had one student who, without being German, had something of an interest in Germany and who knew a bit about German history. And so what that means is that presumably to most people in the US, Germany is more sort of an ideal. It's either an ideal related to economic efficiency or to National Socialism. And beyond that, there's really not that much knowledge available. It's not something that's being reported on regularly, etc. And so, especially in the context of our department, with its interest in globalization and political economy, it's on the one hand somewhat striking that basically the pillar economy of the EU, or the country that has the pillar economy of the EU, is really little known and of little interest. There's another society for which exactly the same thing could be said, which also went through a similar history in many regards, and that's Japan, of course. So that's indicative of sort of basically a kind of self-referentiality in terms of the perspective that that the U.S. as a society promotes, and that's being perpetuated. So I decided, okay, let's focus on that. So it's not so much my biography, sort of in a kind of C. Wright Millsian way. It's not my particular biography that's of interest, which I don't find particularly exciting. It's quite predictable in many ways. But how my biography is hooked into a different societal framework that in many regards is quite similar to the US. In the mid-1980s, in a speech Habermas gave to the Spanish Parliament, this was in '84, and historically it's somewhat loaded because 3 years, I think it was 3 years earlier, there had been an attempt in Spain by a right-wing segment of the military to overthrow democracy. That at that point was not very old, since Spain had been ruled by Franco, the dictator, into the 1970s. So in the early 1980s, was it in 80 or 81? It was during my last year in high school, I remember that. There was an attempt to overthrow the democratically elected government by right-wing putschists. And they would have been successful if one person would have reacted differently, and that one person was the king. Spain is a monarchy. And so the putschists assumed, well, we became as a representative of a monarchy, so obviously he doesn't like this whole idea of democracy anyway. And so if we try to overthrow this democratic government, then he'll be in support of us, not of them. And he came out very strongly at that point and used all the mass media means at his disposal to condemn this attempt to abolish democracy. And so the push didn't last very long, and democracy was saved, so to speak, in Spain. And partly in reaction to that, the Spanish Parliament invited a number of intellectuals, pro-democratic intellectuals, to give lectures in front of the Parliament about the state of affairs in the 1980s, the condition of democracy, etc. And Habermas was one of those. And the lecture he gave was about the crisis of the welfare state and the exhaustion of utopian energies, as he put it. And in that lecture, this is the point I'm getting to, in that lecture he said that Germany is so similar to the US that all that it is, I mean, Germany is so close to being the 52nd state of the US that essentially all that's missing is the right to participate in elections. And so from a European perspective, Germany is quite like the US in lots of ways. I'm not sure whether, the main competitor is England, but England has a monarchy. Germany doesn't have a monarchy or an aristocracy. It was abolished at the end of, it was not abolished in the sense of people not being allowed to have titles anymore, but it was abolished as a class that had particular access to politics or to political power. In Austria, for example, just where I've been teaching the last couple of summers, they completely abolished the aristocracy at the end of the First World War. So they lost all of their titles, the aristocracy. And I actually talked to one of my colleagues when I was there a few weeks ago for a conference. He's a colleague in sociology, and he grew up in Vienna. Most of the academics in Austria seem to have some connection to Vienna. Either they're from Vienna, the capital, or they studied in Vienna. And so he was from Vienna and he studied in Vienna. And we had a conversation, and during the conversation he mentioned that he lived for several years in the main palace in Vienna. And basically his father was a civil servant. And so in the 1930s, 1940s, when he was a kid, his father, as a civil servant, got access to an apartment in the palace, and so he essentially grew up in the royal palace and played on the lawn, played soccer on the lawn, etc. That's as far as it went in Austria. And the palace, this is not the city palace, it's the palace on the outskirts, Schönbrunn, if anyone's been there. It's basically the equivalent of Versailles, but in Vienna. It's closer to the core than Versailles is to the city center of Paris. Then Germany, the aristocracy was not abolished, but it's in many ways it's a society that's quite similar to to the US. The constitution, for example, Germany formally doesn't have a constitution. It's sort of, it's somewhere between. I mean, England doesn't have a constitution at all. England has a Bill of Rights. I mentioned that in the theory class last week. So in England, the kind of constitutional guarantees that most democracies have don't exist. And that means that the parliament or the prime minister actually has the power. It would be quite crazy if he or she would actually use that power. But the prime minister has the power to suspend all elections indefinitely. It would not be a violation of the law in England in terms of how the political system is set up. Germany has something that's called the Basic Law, and this Basic Law was created after the Second World War to essentially engender strong democracy. Democracy that would withstand authoritarian or leftist tendencies in society in reaction to National Socialism. And the constitution that was written, I mean, ultimately it was written by German legal scholars. But the German legal scholars that had been selected in a manner in which they were most inspired by the work that had been done in the US by legal scholars in terms of how to construct a strong, up-to-date, very pro-democratic constitution in a manner in which it basically would be impossible institutionally to overthrow the democratic institutions. And so there are basically two levels of mediations. On the one hand, there's the US with the Constitution, and I mean, there are various interpretations of the constitutional tradition in the US, of course. There are right now, I mean, they've become stronger and stronger in the last couple of decades, so-called originalists, who refuse, basically, who reject the idea that the Constitution needs to be interpreted in light of subsequent social historical changes. And several of the Supreme Court justices adhere to this. Alito and Thomas and who's the third one? Another Italian. What's his name?
Those are the two I remember.
Who's the third one? Maybe the other Italian, or American of Italian descent. What's his name? I can't call him up either.
Yeah, I can't think of it.
I mean, they basically are originalists, and so they reject the idea that that we have to look at the Constitution in light of the fact that the society in which the Constitution was written is very different from the society in the early 21st century, for example. And so on the one
Even
hand,
Roberts to some degree. Even Roberts
yeah,
to some degree.
he's leading in that direction,
Cool.
but he's not the one. And so in the US, you had basically tension during the 1930s and 1940s between the originalists, who were not very strong at that point, and the progressives, liberals, who had a much more process-oriented, a much more interpretive perspective on the Constitution. And they were represented especially by legal scholars at Ivy League universities. And so they made arguments and basically oriented their work in the direction of figuring out what it would take to update the American Constitution. So to retain the spirit of the original Constitution, but to adapt it to modern mass society and industrialized society, and with industrialized economies and so forth. And so they also recognized at the same time that that updating the American Constitution would be extremely difficult, and that essentially their efforts are futile, or were futile. And we'll get into this next week or the following week when we talk about Durkheim, because the Constitution is the kind of totem Durkheim in his writings refers to as grounding the distinction between the sacred and profane in modern societies. And so the Constitution within the US, I mean the Constitution with its content, in terms of how it is formulated, is essentially treated as a sacred document within the US. And so changing the Constitution would be interpreted by lots of people as a direct attack on the US, even if the purpose of changing the Constitution would be to improve it or to update it. And I mean, there's a lot of work has been done on this issue of constitutions over the course of the last 50 years at least. When I was a student in New York, Mario Cuomo was trying regularly to get a new constitution for the state of New York adopted, and there was a constitutional convention, and it didn't go anywhere. And he was extremely frustrated. I mean, he regards that as the biggest failure of his governorship, and he was governor for 12 years, that he was not able to facilitate that process. And the Constitution of New York State, you probably know more about this than I do, was described in those days definitely as unbelievably dysfunctional. And so that this is reflected in the inefficiencies of government, the difficulties to compel both houses to work together, which is happening very rarely, etc., etc., etc. And so Cuomo's argument actually was New York City in 1980 is very different from New York City or New York State. We can take, basically, I mean, he focused on the relationship. The relationship between New York State and New York City is very different in 1980 compared to 1880. And I think the previous constitution had been passed in 1883, somewhere around that corner. So it was about 100 years old, and that was part of how he justified it. The convention took place, went on for quite some time, 2 years or so. It's not a continuous thing. I mean, people meet regularly, etc. And at the end, when it was completed, he went on state television and basically declared that that the result of the Constitutional Convention is that there's no way that the Constitution that New York State has could be put at disposal, because it would be extremely difficult to come up with a new constitution for the state. That essentially the lag that had occurred between possibilities of updating the Constitution, which might have been possible in the 1920s, for example, or the 1930s, had become so great that almost sociologically speaking, there's not enough of a reason to assume that if the Constitution would be put up for grabs, so to speak, that the various groups making up New York, the population of New York State, could agree to a new constitution. And one of the reasons for that was the tension between the whole lifestyle of New York City and the mode of life in upstate New York. And I had a job interview at some point. This was in 1999 in Plattsburgh. And the night before the formal interview, they invited me for dinner. And during the dinner, they described to me what I wanted to know. What is it like up here? And is it true that politics up here is as monolithically Republican as it was monolithically Bolshevik in the Soviet Union? And that was the impression one got from New York City, from the perspective of New York City. And he said, yeah, definitely, or they said, there's no question about it, that during the 1980s, when Bernie Sanders, who's now senator in Washington, one of the senators for Vermont, across Lake Champlain, was mayor of Burlington, which is the biggest city of Vermont. I think it has 38,000 people, so it's all quite small. I think Vermont itself only has 308,000 people, so population of Vermont. That when Bernie Sanders, self-declared socialist, was the mayor of Burlington, there were various militias forming in and around Plattsburgh to prevent the takeover of the city of Plattsburgh and that part of New York State by socialists invading from Vermont. And so I laughed, of course, and I said, "Don't laugh." They were quite serious. I mean, they purchased arms. They did weekly exercises every Sunday, and so if you were near the areas where they trained, you would hear a lot of shooting, etc. They were pretty serious. And so this basically, I mean, New York City, in terms of how people live there, this was basically Cuomo's point. How people live in New York with a degree of tolerance for different lifestyles, etc., etc., etc. This was in the late 80s. There was just no way that could be reconciled with the kind of constitution that conservatives upstate New York, which basically were pretty much monolithically in power, that there was no way of getting the two to agree on anything. And so it's better to stick with the constitution we have, even though it sucks. Pretty much the Constitution of New York State. And I'm curious, maybe, I don't think I mentioned this in the theory class, there's one state in the Union that has a constitution that requires that it be updated every 20 years, or at least that there be a decision to have a constitutional convention to update the constitution or to suspend it and to revisit the issue 20 years later. Does anyone know what that state is? It's Florida. I know because I lived there. And the previous president of the university was actually in charge in, I think in 1990, of rewriting the Constitution. And so in Florida, there has been this practice since I think it became a state in 1848. So since 1868 to revisit the Constitution and to look at it and to consider the fact that in 1848, when the Constitution initially was adopted, when Florida became a state, essentially most of what is now the state was undeveloped. There were a few Native Americans living downstate. There were a few settlements along the coastline. But Florida at that point was basically the area between Pensacola and St. Augustine. And so the population growth that occurred since then occurred during subsequent decades. And so Miami didn't exist at all. And it's sort of a joke question. It was until 2000 on Jeopardy! 2, apparently. What's the capital of Florida? And most people answer Miami, Tampa, Orlando, but it's Tallahassee. And Tallahassee is a pretty small state. It's smaller than Knoxville. And so there are lots of ins and outs in that regard. But it's interesting that there actually is one constitution that was formulated in a way in which updating it to changing structural and infrastructural circumstances, demographic changes, shifts in power, changes in the economy, that became a requirement. So quite interesting. Okay, this all actually relates in various ways to what I was planning to talk about, and I'll speed this up a bit. Do I have?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit flexible because Steve is not coming afterwards. I also realized I forgot to go around the room, so maybe at some point before we do more
we can do that right now, yeah.
we
So
can do it now.
I don't know the two of you, and the two of you, I know everybody else.
Yeah, you've met most people through the theory class. So all right, so the non-sociology first years get to introduce.
I'm Michelle. I am an MPH student studying community health education, second year. Took my comps. I'll be done in December.
Very good.
So
Okay.
that's me.
I'm Reed. I'm a second year Master of Public Health student as well.
Okay. That has a tradition. Students from public health take this seminar. I've had quite a few over the course of those 4 years. Yes.
We've got another one. I'm Jamie French, and I'm
Okay.
in public health with a built environment interest.
John Reckner. I'm a fourth year doc student in counselor education,
Okay.
so not public health.
Right. Very good. So, let me just jump in. I grew up in a pretty small town in southwest Germany on the edge of the Black Forest. Not in the Black Forest, about 2 miles east of the Black Forest. It's a small town, 1,500 people, but it's about 1,000 years old and has been around that time during those time period. Initially it was a bit small, of course. It was essentially monolithically Catholic when I grew up. There were very few non-locals. Everybody knew everybody else. Ethnically, when I was a child in particular, it was completely homogeneous. There were no foreigners in the town. That changed a bit later on. I was born in the early 60s, and during the 60s, the German government established various guest worker programs. You may see this term occasionally these days. There was an article in the Times last week about creating something similar in the US to enable especially workers from Mexico to come in legally without having to, without the government, the US government having to make a commitment in terms of citizenship. And so with that guest worker program, which essentially was a response to a lack of workers in Germany during the 1960s, some foreigners started moving in. The biggest community of Turks outside of Turkey, for example, is not just in Germany, but in Berlin too. And so that's the other part of the country. But there were a couple of Turkish families that everybody knew. There were a few. I think there was one family that was Italian and one family that was Greek. And that was it. And everybody knew them, and they lived in particular houses, and they were just the foreigners. I mean, no one had any particular problems with them, as far as I can tell. But it was pretty ethnically homogeneous. And so at that point already, the German economy was doing very well, the West German economy, I have to say. And Germany was divided after the Second World War in a way that's similar to Korea, the way Korea still is divided. And so the West German economy started working very quickly, very efficiently, as soon as it was allowed to do so in the early 1950s. And the economic development that occurred was referred to in the literature and in Europe at the time as the economic miracle. You may have heard that. And one of the reasons for that was clearly, I mean, partly that there was a tradition of industriousness and so forth established already that preceded the Third Reich. But it also provided an opportunity for people to construct a new identity that was different from the political and cultural identity of National Socialism. And it's kind of interesting that Tucker Parsons actually may have had some influence over that. So there's a whole set of publications by Parsons, and Parsons was, as I like to, for the non-sociologists, he was what I like to refer to as the Pope of American sociology after World War II, after 1951. And he died in 1979. During the 1940s, he worked for the OSS. Does anyone know what the OSS was?
CIA.
Right. I think it was called the Office of Strategic Studies. And the purpose of it was primarily, initially, to identify pro-democratic forces in formerly fascist societies. And so Parsons worked for the OSS, so did Marcuse. I don't know whether they knew each other at the time. I can't imagine that they didn't, especially since Parsons was quite the Germanophile. He had written his PhD dissertation in Germany, and his whole writing style, as lots of people have complained about for decades, is quite Germanic, which makes it not exactly easy to read. And both of them actually, this is an irony of history, died in the same year, within a few months of each other, in Munich or close to Munich. And so their assignment was to figure out what the foundations could be for functioning democracies in Europe, Germany and Italy on the one hand, and Japan on the other hand. And they were responsible for Germany. So Parsons and Marcuse and others were responsible for Germany. And during this time, Parsons, he went sort of as a theorist, went through a bit of a valley, so to speak, because he had tried to revolutionize sociology and create sociology in his image in a 2-volume work in 1937, in the middle of the Great Depression, that didn't go anywhere. And so it took him 14 years after that to come up with a new proposal. And that second proposal, which is called The Social System, published in 1951, turned him into the Pope of sociology. And so during the interim, he was looking for possibilities of doing something else that was productive and that might enable him to figure out an alternative strategy for creating sociology as a science, as a formal science that was able to compete with economics and psychology and other disciplines. And one issue he was working on was basically the healthcare system in the US, including the mental healthcare system. The other issue he was working on was basically how to stabilize Europe after the end of the Second World War. So there's one book, it's called Tucker Parsons and National Socialism, where the different essays he wrote during this time, not all of them were published, are collected. And And he was actually a strong advocate of something that later on became the Marshall Plan. His argument was that a Marshall Plan should be created to enable, especially Germany and Japan, to enable the people of those two countries to construct a non-political identity built around economic success. And that was the best, basically the best hope for those countries to become part of the Western Hemisphere. So that preventing them from developing again economically would have catastrophic consequences. And that if those two countries were to develop in a manner that was not prone to falling back into some kind of totalitarian regime, the strategies that were employed at the end of World War I had to be avoided at all costs. And so basically, not only did both of those countries not get burdened with huge reparations, which had been the case after the end of World War I, something that Keynes had vigorously fought against and successfully for similar reasons. Not only did those countries not have to pay reparations, they actually got huge resources to reconstruct, to rebuild their economic infrastructure. And there was quite a debate going on at that point in the US, and especially there were, I'm not going to go into it, there were different constituencies in the US. One constituency was very determined to return to an isolationist stance in the US, and the other constituency was very much in favor of expanding the US role internationally. And I mean, economically, there were lots of reasons for that. It had to do with the return of the soldiers, which threatened the US with falling back into the Depression, because the structural reasons for the Depression had not disappeared because of the war. They had been suspended, but they had not disappeared. And so if hundreds of thousands of soldiers would return to the US economy at that point in 1945, then unemployment would be a major problem if the US at the same time also would return to isolationism. Because what isolationism meant under those circumstances was that the US economy is the economy for which the economy produces. So American consumers and companies that needed new equipment, etc., they would be the sole consumers for products created in the US. And so the constituency that was very concerned about that was in favor of expanding the US market. And so the argument was that turning Germany, initially the idea was Germany as a whole, but then it became West Germany when the Soviets occupied the eastern part. And Japan should become two of the primary consumption areas for American products. Those economies had to be rebuilt, not just the economies had to be rebuilt, the whole societies had to be rebuilt. And so there would be tremendous sales opportunities for American companies in those two countries. And so if those two countries would be, the debate was, the isolationists said, let's destroy their industrial infrastructure. Let's basically turn those countries into agrarian countries and prevent them from ever industrializing again. And so for those who were concerned about that, that meant that the US would face tremendous unemployment. And that the economy, I think the productivity of the American economy from 1941 until 1945 quadrupled. So if you look at output per man hour in 1941 and you compare it to 1945, then the American economy had become 4 times more efficient, 4 times more productive over the 4-year period because of the production of equipment and armaments, etc., to sustain the war on two fronts. And so if the economy suddenly would shrink, productivity levels would go way down, and employment would rise. So all the demand, especially from the two fronts, would return. Then what would happen to the economy? I mean, that was the logic behind it. And so there was quite a fight in the government at the time, in the Truman administration. The Truman administration was strongly in favor of it, but business was very much opposed to it. And so essentially, somehow the administration essentially tricked business representations, especially the United States Chamber of Commerce and what's the other one? the National
NAM.
Association of Manufacturers, right?
Yeah.
To essentially shut up temporarily. So the Business Council and the Council of Economic Development, I think it was called, which were much smaller than the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, they were driving forces behind this. And so the decision was made that those countries, rather than being left alone, that the US would have to become very involved in how those societies would emerge.
I got a question. Do you mind interruptions? And
No, not at all.
And are you going to come back to this thread of persons as sociology as science compared to your view of sociology? Or is that part of the theory class?
It's definitely part of the latter, but I can,
Yeah.
I mean, if you remind me later, I
Yeah.
can make a point about
Yeah.
that, definitely. So we're in the 60s now. I mean, the US is, I mean, Germany is occupied, of course. I mean, Germany remained at war with the Western Allies, as they were called from the perspective of Germany, until the official end of the Cold War, until 1990. So there was no peace treaty between the German government and the French, British, Canadian, and American governments. It was a truce. And so Germany remained occupied, not just East Germany by the Soviets, but West Germany was occupied too by I mean, there were several zones, and they were shared in different ways between Americans, Canadians, Brits, and French. And so depending on which area one grew up with, one had to learn a particular foreign language or a set of foreign languages. And so in my case, that meant that I had to learn English and French. And I had both for 7 years, 5 hours a week or so. I was not very good in English. I liked French much more.
Sorry.
Well, it didn't last, obviously. And,
Dr. Dahms, what was the city? What's the city you grew up in?
it's a small town.
What's it
It's called Windsor. It's very close to Rottweil.
Okay.
And that's the best known town in the area, where the Rottweiler dogs come from, actually.
You said southwest?
Southwest, yeah.
Okay.
It's, if you know where Stuttgart is,
Yeah,
it's exactly 1 hour south of Stuttgart.
okay, okay.
And 1 hour north of Constance, where I went to the university later on. And 40 miles southwest of Tübingen, which is where Hegel was a high school student. And approximately 1.5 hours northwest of Freiburg, where Heidegger was a professor. So it's, I mean, it's the whole area is very saturated with philosophy and poetry and social theory too. And Horkheimer was from one of the suburbs of Stuttgart, for example, Bad Cannstatt. And Bloch actually taught in Tübingen. He was the leading Marxist philosopher in post-World War II, in both post-World War II Germanies. First he was in East Germany, and he was teaching in Tübingen for 1 semester, and during the semester when he was teaching in Tübingen, the wall was built. And so he decided not to return. And so he stayed as a professor until he died in '79 too. And so I mean this, I mean basically we grew up knowing this. I mean, this was just, we knew that these people were around, it's kind of normal. And so in the 60s, I mean basically the first, I mean, this is something that then, I mean both of these events turned out to be quite formative. One was, I have 2 first memories that were of historical or world historical character, so to speak. One was the moon landing in '69, the first one, which was a huge deal. I was 7 at that point. And the other, which happened soon thereafter, a change in government in Germany. Up until that point, conservatives and liberals had been in power. And liberals are free Democrats in Germany, which are essentially market liberals. And in the fall of '69, there was a national election, and I mean, parliamentary democracies often form a government based on coalitions between different parties, because it's quite rare that in parliamentary systems, one party gets the majority, unless it's set up like Britain. But even there, it's not working, because Britain too now has a coalition between the Tories and what are they called?
British Labour?
No, the smaller party, that's the coalition partner of Cameron. There's something liberal. I think there are two. There's a sort of a social democratic party that's right of labor, sort of, and there's a free democratic party too, in some form. And they form the coalition government, and so that's quite common. And so basically, before elections, it's usually clear that the coalition will be in power, but it's not clear which coalition will be in power. And there's a lot of, after election, there's a lot of negotiating between the parties. You probably have heard about it with regard to Israel, where this is a huge issue every time there's an election. How does the government acquire 50% of the seats in order to be able to govern? And Israel has a lot of parties. Because there's many parliamentary systems have a clause. The German system has that too. It's one of the main differences between the post-1949 constitution and the post-World War I constitution. That the post-World War I constitution, basically any party that had enough votes to elect one member of parliament would be able to send a member of parliament to the parliament, which meant that by the time Hitler came to power, not with a majority, I think there were something like 30 parties represented, between 25 and 30 parties in Germany in 1930, spring or mid-January of 1933. And so after the Second World War, a clause was built into the system according to which a party has to have 5% of the votes in order to be represented, to prevent this fragmentation of parties. And so in '69 it wasn't clear which one would, what kind of a coalition would form, and the Free Democrats, as market liberals, had made a commitment to continue to work with the Conservatives, and as they had done up until that point. And this is announced before the elections, it's part of the whole election campaign, etc. And the election took place, and wow, something happened. The Free Democrats actually could choose between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. And depending on their choice, you would either have a left of center national government or a right of center national government. And they decided to go with the Social Democrats, which was a huge event. And I remember it because my father was absolutely furious when the results were announced on television in the evening, and he was just cooking for the rest of the day. And I thought, this sounds like something interesting. Maybe later on I need to pay attention to this kind of stuff. And I found out later on from one of the architects of this new coalition, one person who had been actively involved in making it possible, how it all went down. That person is, I've mentioned it to the sociology students, was Ralph Dahms, who is probably one of the best known German post-World War II sociologists, who I studied with later on and worked for 2.5 years. And he described the whole story to me at some point. There were basically, there was the leaders, there was a small leadership elite, sort of a clique in the leadership of the Free Democrats, who wanted to get away from the Conservatives. And so they started secret negotiations with the candidate for Chancellor of the Social Democrats, who was very much progressive, so almost a radical Democrat. He had been a resistance fighter in the Second World War, fighting the Germans in Norway. And Willy Brandt was his name. He's probably not well known. He was Man of the Year in Newsweek in 1970. And his name is kind of funny. Willy Brandt was actually, that was not his real name. He had a much longer name. But when he started working with the resistance in Norway in the 1940s, fighting the Nazis, and de facto Germans occupying Norway, he changed his name. It's kind of funny. When he was a student in the 1920s in Germany, and he took courses with a socialist of the chair. It's a term. I mean, Durkheim is kind of a socialist of the chair, and term means, there's another term for it in German and in France, but it basically means that they're socialists as teachers, but that doesn't mean that they're activists, that they're into party politics, etc. And so this guy, he took these classes with this guy, and his name was Wilbrandt. It was clearly inspired by the guy. He was basically sort of a reform socialist in the Weimar Republic. And so when Willy Brandt decided to fight the Nazis, he split the name of this guy. That was his last name, Wilbrandt, into two, and turned it into Willy Brandt. So he basically named himself, he created a new identity in the image of this professor he had. And then in '69 became chancellor. And so the most powerful person in the country. And there were three democratic politicians who had engaged in these secret negotiations with him. So if his party would get enough votes to form a majority government with the liberals, that they essentially would declare that the party would go with him. And the three people were the guy who became the first foreign secretary, or Secretary of State in that administration, and sort of an intellectual who was a politician, career politician who was an intellectual, and Dahms, a sociologist who later on became my professor. They essentially engineered the whole thing. And so at that point, starting in '69, the Social Democrats remained in power until '82. There was a whole burst of reforms. And this was the time when I started going to school, and then especially to high school. And so basically my whole educational experience as a student in primary and secondary education, not in tertiary education, coincided with this very progressive, the two very progressive administrations, social democratic administrations, who were pushing as hard as they could for the establishment of a democratic culture. And so the government actually became a tool to establish the social and cultural foundations for a functioning democracy, which had not been the case before. Before it was more like sort of a caretaker government. We don't really like democracy, but we have to put up with it because we agreed to it and because we would not have been able to reindustrialize, but we really don't like it, especially. And so this was the first administration that was strongly in support of democracy. And there was a huge educational reform that resulted from it, and Dahms had been a strong proponent of educational reform. And during the 1960s had been extremely frustrated with the fact that there were no attempts being made by the German government to create more equality in terms of access to high school and to universities in particular. And the educational system still is quite different in that regard. Only about basically at any time between 35 and 40% of every year that graduates went to high school. So high school is not like public high school in the US. It's not an expectation. It's not a requirement. Only a segment of the population, a bit more than a third, actually goes to high school. And so those are the only ones who are eligible then to go to the university. There was no college at that point. There is still no college, but there are BAs now. Bachelor degrees have been created in the last few years to compatibilize international education. And so Dahms, who was a free Democrat in terms of party affiliation, but quite not socialist, but social in his orientation, had been very frustrated about the fact that the government had not been used to create greater equality in this regard. And so there was this explosion of reforms across the society, including in the educational system, and including in the substance of the educational system. And so this is something that the government just decided. And it had the power. I mean, that's how government works in Germany. In many of the parliamentary systems, if the government decides something, then it just basically happens. There can be moaning and groaning, but it's easier to bring about change in those kinds of systems than in the US, for example, where basically the German Constitution, for example, the structure is very similar to the US. You have you have a president, but the president is a representative. It's basically a substitute for the queen or the king in a monarchy. And so the president has no real power. The only power the president has is to disband the government, the parliament. in emergency situations, or if he, so far has always been a man, he's being asked to do so in order to allow for early elections. That's it. Aside from that, it's representative. And the most powerful person, which is the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, is the person elected by the majority of the Parliament. And so you have, basically, it's like if, in the current situation, if Obama would be the Prime Minister, and the House of Representatives would be the equivalent of the Parliament in Germany, then the majority of, basically there is a person who is declared to become the next Chancellor, but whether that is the case depends on the support of the party. So even if one party, for example, cares this person will be the Chancellor if we win the majority, then the majority of the Parliament still has to approve that person. So there's still a possibility of change, etc. And the result of this is that there is significantly greater sort of identity between the majority of the Parliament and the government structure. And it's much more difficult to build up resistance to that. And
I should maybe try to push you towards
Okay.
drawing out the threads of this so that we can open it up.
Right,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's okay, that's okay. I mean, part of where you started was that this German history and the German political system is not familiar here. And
Right.
so I appreciate what you're doing to familiarize.
Let me see, let me just make a few points. So I said that this, I mean, essentially that my school experience coincided with this period of reforms. This had a number of very concrete, I mean, this took a number of very concrete forms. One was this educational reform in terms of substance that I referred to a moment ago. It became a law that all students going to high school, it asked me why this did not apply to middle school or people school, as it's called. So if you finish with the 9th grade, then it's called people school, and if you finish with 10th grade, it's middle school. And if you finish with 13th grade, it's now been compressed to 12. It's high school, or gymnasium is what it's called. And in gymnasium, it became a requirement that 2 years in 2 areas, at least 2 areas, had to be taught exclusively on National Socialism. So before that, that was not the case. So until the Social Democratic Liberal administration came into power, National Socialism was not taught in schools. It was taught possibly if one teacher sort of made the commitment to doing so, but if a teacher actually did that, that teacher would put him or herself on a very icy turf very quickly, because it was not looked upon favorably by the government and by the elites in Germany, etc. And so with this new administration coming in, they essentially decided that education is state domain. And so the federal government is not supposed to have any influence over how states determine curricular content, requirements for competing degrees, etc., etc., etc. But in this case, the government just basically decided this had to be done, and the law was passed. And it would have backfired if there would have been attempts to reverse that. And so we were taught about National Socialism explicitly and consistently for several hours a week over the course of 2 years. Not everything was about that. And basically in 2 fields, in history and in social studies, we had to be taught about it. And this was very unpleasant to most students. It was very unpleasant to most teachers too. But it was mandated. And so I was part of the first generation that was taught in school what had happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945. And not just in the sense that we were encouraged to do so, we had to do so. And this, basically there were 3 reactions to this. Either it brought about an immediate or soon thereafter cathartic experience where sort of the self, I'm using this language in my classes, where the self became problematized by people, where one recognized, okay, I'm actually a member of a society that committed all of these atrocities, that engaged in huge huge numbers of deaths due to war, due to concentration camps, etc., etc., etc. Basically, how do I reconcile, I mean, speaking of cognitive dissonance, how do I reconcile the image I have created of myself as being a member of this society with the fact that this society also was responsible for all of this, in addition to two world wars. And so one group basically just took this on, not necessarily while it was happening in the classroom, but soon thereafter. And so we talked about it, and later on I became a member of something like a Dead Poets Society. And we would meet on a regular basis, just a group of high school students afterwards at cabins or somewhere in the woods at one of our houses. We usually would meet start meeting between 7 and 9 o'clock in the evening and then talk until whatever, 6, 7 in the morning until we collapsed or had to go back to work or to school, whatever. And we talked, I mean, so I belonged to a group that obviously took on these issues. And so there was a commitment to thinking about what this, I mean, that's the language I would use today, what this meant ethically. I mean, how do you actually develop a positive sense of self and a positive self in light of the fact that all of this happened and that our parents were part of this, or that they were children of this, as was the case in my case. My father was 7, my mother 10 when this was over. But nevertheless, I mean, we were products of this in some form. Another group just basically sort of blocked off, didn't want to hear anything about it, and they just essentially refused to deal with this on any level. And another group had an extremely violent reaction to all of this. And so they absolutely did not want to submit to the stuff that they were being taught. And this was something they just didn't want to hear, and they were just basically furious the entire time that this was happening. And at that point, sort of, I mean, this was an early experience. I was probably 12 when this started, when these reforms started kicking in. It became very clear that there were serious, I mean, major differences in terms of how people dealt with stuff. Another change that happened that was really driven up during this time period was, I mean, there was no private television or private radio. It was all not sort of public, but it was called public legal, which meant that all radio stations, all television stations had board of overseers who were constituted by representatives of major groups in society, by the political parties, by the churches, by universities, by labor unions, etc. And so every station, and there were usually 2 main stations in each state, had a board of overseers whose purpose it was to make sure that the content was balanced. That, for example, if there would be one program that was favorable to the conservatives, then there would be another program favorable to the social democrats, etc., to make sure that a broad range of perspectives would be presented and that no group would be excluded. This also applied to the unions. So if there was stuff in programming that was favorable to employers' associations, then the trade unions or the labor unions also had to be able to voice their concerns and their perspectives, etc.
But the educational program didn't have room, obviously, for what becomes the neo-Nazis, the pro-Nazi.
No. And legally, we basically, there's freedom of speech in Germany, unless freedom of speech is being used to undercut the institutions of the democratic social whole. That's how it would be translated. Das demokratische Gemeinwesen. So it's not just a democratic state, but the society as a whole is supposed to be democratically organized. And so if people, for example, insist that the Holocaust never happened, or that that foreigners should be thrown out, etc., anything of that sort, but especially, I mean, for example, denying the Holocaust, that the Holocaust happened, is a crime. And it's not a misdemeanor or anything like that, it's treated as a crime. And so if someone stands, whatever, if someone walks down the mall here and stops on Volunteer Drive and then starts distributing flyers, the Holocaust never happened, if this would be in Germany, that person definitely would be arrested if a cop would find out that that's the case. And the chances are quite high that the person would go to prison. And so it depends on the frequency of the offenses, etc. But that's not freedom of speech, basically. That's interpreted as a direct attack on the democratic society and on the Constitution, and that's not accepted. And there is a huge consensus across German society that there's no problem with that. I mean, this is not. So I mean, there are boundaries on freedom of speech, and the state has to have the ability to maintain those boundaries. So this has never been an issue, and I mean that's. And I mean, there are quite a few institutions like that.
I believe it's the same in France.
Yeah, I think so too. And so this is not only considered to be not only not considered to be problematic. This is considered to be how democratic societies relate to attempts to attack their security. And so
do you view it as an irony? I mean, to look from that perspective at the United States, that we didn't switch to democratic socialism in '69, and yet we have this kind of different relationship to freedom of speech.
Right. I mean, it's quite interesting. When I was teaching in Austria this summer too, and it's the same there. Austria was as active in National Socialism as Germany, and Hitler was Austrian. But it's just considered odd. I mean, there's difference. People don't really know, or students don't really know what to say about the difference that the democratic system of the U.S. is less willing to defend itself against people who question its legitimacy. I mean, it's sort of there's another component to this, which is the attitude. I mean, the thing that Europeans, or German-speaking Europeans, have the greatest difficulties with is that I taught a course on Europe this summer, so it was very comparative. I used American exceptionalism as the foil to teach European culture and social structure, as it was called. And so one of the things that came up was how it is possible for Americans to be at the same time very patriotic and to absolutely despise their government. And this is something that's basically in the Austrians, for example, I had almost only Austrian students in that particular class. They didn't know what to do with it. Just didn't make sense. So in Austria, if someone is patriotic, that person also is very staunchly in support of the government. And so how people actually navigate this discrepancy, they didn't really know what to do with it. And I mean, if I would be pressed to explain it, I would have difficulties too. It's like, I mean, there's something very odd at work. It's almost like the people who despise government relate to government as something that's like an occupying force that's inhabited by some kind of aliens or something. It's obviously not Americans, because if the government would be made up of Americans, then why would one hate it? So if one hates the government, one hates the people who make up the government, who are Americans. So I mean, that's an example for cognitive dissonance. There are things that really don't fit together that well. Just as an aside.
Dr. Dahms, isn't it true that German flags only come out during the World Cup? You just don't see German flags.
And on holidays, right?
Yeah, but here you're seeing it on T-shirts. You're seeing it where someone who wears it on their T-shirt doesn't necessarily have strong feelings
Right.
for the government or happy
Right.
about that at all.
And I mean, businesses and people are not, I mean, sort of families are not allowed to have a German flag in their garden, for example. It's basically not consistent with the use of the flag. So I mean, the flag is used to communicate something that's sort of, I don't know how to describe it. I would actually have to think about exactly how to verbalize this sociologically, but they're basically only supposed to be used for public events. And then During World Cups, it's suspended, so people can paint it on their foreheads and stuff like that.
Of course.
It's like a temporary craze that's benign. Yes.
In late capitalism doesn't kind of make
And
sense that
by
people.
the way, in Austria, one never sees the flag. I was really amazed. I mean, I was in Innsbruck, the town where I taught, is the capital of Tyrol, which is one of the states in Austria. Even in front of the government, there are no Austrian flags. I mean, they're a government building. There are just no flags anywhere. It's red and white. And so you basically see them mostly on like on palaces and so forth, on castles, on the shutters, on windows. They're usually painted red and white. But beyond that, it's very rare. I mean, it's probably in Tyrol, I have to say. The reason is in part that the Tyroleans are not too happy with the fact that they're part of Austria. And so there are all sorts of tensions there that would rather be their own thing, I guess. I mean, there are various kinds of separatism in different parts of Europe, of course. Last week we talked about Scotland. There have been serious attempts in Scotland for them to become part of the EU on their own, not as part of the UK, etc. They have their own parliament, etc. Yes.
I was gonna ask, in a way, like, doesn't it make sense that Americans respond to the government as an occupying force? Since, if you think about it in terms of alienation, like, it's given this objective existence, so they are just responding to it as if it's independent of human beings, which makes perfect sense, in a way, because in a way that is how we orient ourselves to our structures. No, or just
I think it
throwing
makes
that out
sense.
there.
I don't see any cognitive dissonance there. I think that I'm quite patriotic, and I have to say that I think Americans basically view the source of being American as something separate from the government.
How does that work? I mean,
Kinda
how would
like
you
we-
explain it?
Well, it's kind of, I don't know, it depends. It can be generational, like how long has your family been in the country, that kind of thing. It's kind of almost a shared experience and shared values that we, I suppose, commit to, and we value the commitment to those. And it's kind of hard to express because it's complicated. I mean, you could write an entire dissertation on it. But what I'm saying is I don't think that we ask permission from the government to be American. And we've always kind of viewed ourselves that way. I mean, people were American originally because they showed up and said, hey, we're American, and maybe killed a few Indians and took the spot where they were living. I mean, basically
Rob
it's...
Keaton would say quite a few.
Yes, well, I don't know.
That's one of our students who's working on genocide.
Most of it was disease, some 80%. But the point is, though, that, I don't know, I think that we draw our source of Americanness from something different. And the idea of even asking the government whether we could be American or not is deeply offensive to our values. Like say, can we be American? Because, no, we were American before that government ever got started.
How did you answer that? I mean, how did that enter the equation? That one has to...
I mean, okay, well, I mean, look at probably the formation of our government. I mean, the people were here before the government was.
Okay.
Well, I'm
No,
saying,
except we had a revolution to form our own government.
yeah, but
Not,
it's a system.
not to form an anarchy, but to form our own government. So to me, there still is, I share the cognitive dissonance.
Well, I know,
You
but the
to me,
idea, being an American, is that you are working out your own system. And does it work? No. Are we constantly in a dialectical situation? Yes. But I mean, we are the ones who are supposed to be the master of the government. Does it work?
Well, I
No.
wonder, actually,
But-
for enough of working out our own system, whether it's not, what I see here, and actually, my wife who's not from here, but we've been married for going on 20 years, and she spent a lot of time here now, sees the United States as a collection of states. That our notion of United States is really states with real power. And so, and yet, well, people wave the state flag, that's a little more controversial. But bring it down to an even more local level. There's a real faith in local government.
A greater faith in local government, yes.
And patriotism at the same time, which still to me is difficult to hold together, but that seems to me to characterize the United States.
I think people just don't, in our society, don't feel like they really own the government. Maybe the way that a lot of European nations feel that when they go out and they march and protest, their government listens more often. That's a very patriotic thing to do. People go out and they protest a lot. Here, it's people go out and protest, and the majority gets really angry at them for doing that. I just think that, we've been by and large taken over, our government has been taken over, it's been hijacked by big business for so long that, you know, it's hard to know who to trust. And it seems like every person that you put in that says they're going to do something that's supposed to be for the people, they end up not doing things for the people, they end up doing things for big government. I think it's very frustrating to people because it feels like it's not really a government that's buying for the people or that the people even have a voice in it anymore.
I mean, look at our major parties. I mean, we vote for people who are presented to us to vote for them. I mean, we're given the choices. Very few people actually have a choice over who becomes, you know, who's nominated. And so, I mean, it has been hijacked. I mean,
And now
it's
with
very
corporations having
But I think at the
personhood,
same time, the people in the United States who claim to have the most patriotism or pull to that rhetoric the most are people who support corporations more than the state. So in a way, like, they're identifying what you guys are seeing, and which is ultimately the cause of, I guess, the gentrification of the government. But that's not seen as why the government is a separate entity from those things. And that the government may be an occupying force, but capitalism is innately American.
Right, well, I think that a lot of people aren't able to make that connection because of our culture, because we live in a consumer culture that teaches them not to see that connection. But it doesn't mean that they don't feel that like that isn't the cause of their underlying frustration, ultimately.
I think we don't like to own our own failure. I mean, the federal government is a mess a lot of the time, but it also works. We like it when it works. We don't like it when it's, you know, kind of messing things up, the bureaucracy, as you were talking about in class. You know, we don't like the red tape, but we like it when things work together. Like, I mean, most people, I mean, we're for all of our conflicts on all kinds of fronts, I mean, we still have pretty much a Pax Americana going on. I mean, you were talking about, you know, Germany and Japan and how we are not being self-reflective, or I suppose what we are self-reflexive in our capitalism, right? That we're not looking at other societies, but we engineered Germany and Japan as they are now. And, I mean,
influenced to a significant extent.
so.
Or wrote things into their constitutions that we don't even get in our own.
Yeah.
You know,
And I mean,
a lot of social rights, a lot of, you know, basic human rights and meeting of basic needs that we scrape for in this country. So.
I mean, that's a thought I started earlier and I didn't complete it. The Constitution, the German Constitution, which is called the Basic Law, was written by people who essentially worked very closely with American legal scholars who really would have liked to reform the American Constitution. They were not allowed to. They knew that they were not allowed to. And so they used the German Constitution and to some extent the Japanese constitutions to apply the kinds of innovations that they would have preferred to apply to the American Constitution, but because they couldn't, they did it there. And as a consequence of that, I mean, very strong constitutions were formulated there that in terms of social justice, for example, I mean, goes significantly further because the context was a very different one. And because, partly also because labor unions, for example, were recognized as one of the pillars of functioning democratic societies, which in the US obviously is not the case. From the start wasn't the case, and during the New Deal it became the case to some extent. And of course, legally speaking, the constitutions that were formulated after the Second World War were inspired by developments intellectually and theoretically in legal scholarship that that began, emerged, and sort of intensified during the New Deal. And so one of the laws, for example, in Germany was the law of co-determination, which meant that all companies that were publicly traded had to make this. Basically, a structure was put in place according to which the owners and the workers they were basically in charge of making corporate decisions about corporate strategy. So you had management. You basically had three groups of representatives meeting in a room regularly. And this was determined by the government that this had to happen. This was very much like the National Labor Review Board in the US during the 30s. And so corporate decisions were made by the owners of the stocks, representatives of the owners of the stocks, and representatives of the workers. So in terms of what was being produced, when, how, for what kinds of circumstances, and what kinds of ways, etc., the owners and the workers made those decisions, and management had the responsibility of provide information for this purpose, which of course meant some influence. and had to implement those decisions. But management did not decide corporate strategy. And this was something that was, this law of co-determination is written into the Constitution. It's still in place. It's been watered down a bit in the context of globalization, etc. But that's one example. There's another example in terms of how the Constitution is formulated. That the Constitution initially had 4 goals. And these goals, if the government deviated from these 4 goals that the constitutions had to promote with regard to the economy, then people could go in front of the constitutional court, as it's called, and sue the government to change its policies to advance those 4 goals with regard to the role of the economy. It's a social market economy too, which is also written into the Constitution. It's not a free market economy. It's a social market economy, and the difference is that the economy is supposed to work in a way that's conducive to the advancement of the general interest of society, not the advancement of private interests, which means mostly that there has to be some kind of reconciliation too. And this is also written into the Constitution. The 4 goals that are now 5 goals, if I remember correctly, are continuous economic growth, full employment, low inflation, and positive foreign trade, what do you call it?
Balance. The trade balance.
Right, balance. Positive foreign trade balance, so that the country exports more than it imports. And I mean, these are written into the Constitution, so economic policy has to advance these goals. And in the 90s, one more goal was written into the Constitution, and that's environmental protection. And so economic policy, when economic policy is being written, these goals have to be taken into consideration. And policies that are clearly detrimental to any of those policies can be challenged in front of the Constitutional Court, which is the equivalent of the Supreme Court, as soon as the policies are even proposed. So once the government proposes one of those laws, then it can be sued. And this has happened quite a few times. And so the Supreme Court is quite independent, or the Constitutional Court is independent in that regard. And there's all sorts of stuff like that. It's also with regard to educational opportunities, that's part of the Constitution now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are definitely differences. And I mean, this is the context then, and this is the final point I wanted to make.
All right, go ahead, because I have a question.
Well, I mean, I will just make the point, and then
Yeah.
you can ask the question, and then I can elaborate if there's an interest in it. This is the context in which the idea about basic income emerged during the 1980s. So what the problem that emerged during the 1980s, and basically from the 80s until 2 years ago, or last year even, there were three economies that were the largest exporters on earth. These 3 economies were the US, US, Germany, and Japan. Now China is getting into the picture, and I think China is either the biggest or
Size of the
second
economy, it's
biggest.
become second biggest. It's
Right.
overtaken Japan, and I assume
And,
exports as well.
and so you had, from during the 80s, 90s, beginning of this century, you had 3 economies that were exporting more than all other economies. And those economies were the US, Germany, and Japan. They were in hefty competition. So every year, almost every year the results changed. So that meant that, and if you look at these societies, if you look at their material structural situations, they're quite different. In basically Japan, the inhabitable space in Japan, supposedly, if you would put it all together, which is largely coastlines, I'm not sure, I haven't looked at this data in some time, but supposedly that's the case. If you put it all together, Japan is the size of the state of Connecticut. So just the inhabitable and inhabitable areas in which you also can have agriculture, taking out all the mountain ranges and so forth. Supposedly, it's about the size of Connecticut.
They've had a crisis for arable land for almost a millennium.
Or what's available arable land. I mean,
Inhabitable, supposedly
Yeah,
inhabitable.
because the entire country is only the size of Tennessee.
Japan?
Yeah, Japan can fit in Tennessee.
oh,
And the
Okay.
Missouri Mountain So that's
Right.
accurate, yeah, that's,
And it has a population of 100, or it had at that time a population of about 125 million people. So the US population at that time was about 250 million people. So Japan was half the size of the US, so put half the size of the US into Connecticut, structurally and materially. That's comparable. So it's surprising that those two, I mean, these represent very different situations for pursuing economic prosperity and for creating an import-export surplus, an export-import surplus, compared to the US, considering the national resources the US has at its disposal, and the size of the population itself, and the size of the market, etc. And then West Germany, just West Germany initially, and this started during the 80s, before Germany became unified. Then West Germany too was one of the three main competitors. West Germany had a population of 60 million at that point. So that's again half the size of Japan. And the landmass that's comparable, I think it's somewhere between, it's significantly smaller than Texas, but a bit larger than New York State. And so these three economies export more than any other society on this planet. I mean, that's, has to swallow that. Now, what that meant in Germany during the 1980s was that this was accompanied, so with this huge export surplus, which meant that the society really couldn't produce any more. I mean, it couldn't export anything else. Went hand in hand with a stabilization of unemployment at 10%. So you had structural unemployment of 10%, and essentially, basically maximum output. And so, what do you do with that? And the discussion this spawned during the 80s was, well, I mean, this is obviously in conflict with the Constitution. It's in conflict with the principles of the social market economy. It's definitely in conflict with the principles of democracy, because essentially what we're doing is that we knock 10% of the working population out of public life. We are not providing them with the possibility of making a living. We essentially take them out of the possibility of, or we deprive them of the possibility to engage in any kind of public life. Unemployed people were not allowed to study, for example, and get additional education. They lived reasonably well off the state, so that it was limited temporarily. It's more generous than in the US, but it was limited nevertheless, and there was sort of a secondary buffer that was used, but nevertheless, the question was whether it was compatible with the self-understanding of West Germany initially to accept 10% unemployment as something that was consistent with the normative foundations of the society. And so there was basically a consensus that that was not the case. And that spawned a discussion about the welfare state and what does this mean for the welfare state? Do we need to reform it? How can we reform it in a way in which this can be alleviated? How do we distribute the available amount of work that has to be done in a manner that's more equitable across the population? So for me, just mathematically, you could say, well, if 90% of the working population, the population capable of working, is sufficient to sustain the position of Germany as one of the three leading economies, one of the three leading exporters, would it not make sense, mathematically speaking, for 100% of the working population to work the equivalent of 90% of the work they worked before? And so, I mean, basically, representatives of the government immediately explained that this really could not be done for all sorts of reasons. That this would not be, it could not be done in a manner in which the position of Germany as one of the three biggest exporters could be sustained. That's the context in which the debate about basic income started again. And so the debate, this debate is quite old. It goes back to the Renaissance, actually. The idea behind basic income is that the right to live a decent life, which in the US probably would mean pursuit of happiness, so to speak, but the right to live a decent life cannot be tied exclusively or at least primarily, to work if the political economy of a society is capable of providing all those willing to work with a job. So work and income have to be uncoupled. It's not acceptable for a society to eliminate 10% of its population capable of working and willing to work out of public life. I mean, basically to lock them out of public life. And so, I mean, there was one book that was extremely popular, the first book that's spawned a whole chain, a whole wave of books on basic income in Germany alone. It was called Liberation from Forced Labor. It was a collection of essays by some prominent people. And that debate basically has been continuing to go on. And I was exposed to it first because I was Dahms' assistant. So I worked for him for 2.5 years, and he in Germany was the most prominent proponent of basic income. And so he oftentimes was invited to give lectures, etc., speak on television, on radio, on basic income. And so the idea behind basic income at that point was inspired by an ideal that Klaus Offe, who is also a really well-known political sociologist, who actually studied at he got his PhD at the same university where I was, while Dahndorf was one of the founding professors. The university is 4 years younger than I am, the university I went to. And he became a student of Habermas later, and for a while he sort of was a critical theorist. He's no longer, as I found out in May at a conference in Prague. I was not the only one who found that out, to the consternation of a lot of people. But he coined this term of the peace formula. His argument basically was that the reason why the welfare state worked as well as it did after the Second World War was because it essentially was advantageous for all major social groups in society. And so all groups, whether it was employers, whether it was the unions, whether it was the churches, whoever you wanted to look at, the state expanding social welfare was a tremendous stabilizing force in the 50s and 60s, which of course was the condition of the Cold War too, when there was the competition between the two systems, East and West, the US and the Soviet Union, etc. And that the advantages that were recognizable by all the major groups in society made it possible for the welfare state to be expanded. And this basically was the peace formula of Western societies. It's part of what I like to refer to as the post-World War II regime, the Cold War regime in political economy. And during the 80s, it became apparent that this peace formula no longer worked. It still worked to a significant extent, but it no longer fulfilled the same purpose it did in the early 1950s. And so basically something new had to be put in its place. Something that whose benefits would be obvious to all major players, all major decision makers. The benefits would be very obvious with regard to the economic situation of a particular society, and that initially it was called a guaranteed basic income or guaranteed minimum income would be essentially the best solution to the problem. Would essentially make the welfare state unnecessary, so all the resources that are constantly being thrown at the welfare state in order to alleviate a whole array of social problems could be made unnecessary. Those resources could be relocated, so to speak, and in a manner that enables individuals to be in a much better position to make choices. The amount of labor that was available would be redistributed in a manner that would be sort of, in a Durkheimian sense, organic. So from within the economy, the work ethic was far too ingrained already at that point for people to be able, for the vast majority of people, to develop a positive sense of self. If they did not make a living on their own terms, if they were not responsible for making a living themselves, so that there really was no, that arguments that people only work because they have to is, in light of the evidence, is not compelling. There's a study, was a 10-year study conducted in the US that confirmed that already in the early 70s. It's called the New Jersey Income Maintenance Experiment, was started during the Johnson administration as a corollary of affirmative action, sort of the economic side of affirmative action, and executed during the Nixon administration. Nixon was the supporter of the idea of a negative income tax, as it was called in the US at that point. And then with the demise of Nixon's presidency and the oil crisis and so forth in the early 70s, the idea disappeared for about 10 years and then came back in Europe. And there are various organizations. There's an international organization with the acronym BEIEN, B-I-E-N. Initially it was the Basic Income European Network. Then 2 or 3 years ago it became the Basic Income Earth Network. And so basically all the national organizations that are promoting basic income as a policy proposal are organized in this. There's an American version too. And I've been sort of irregularly involved in that for the last 10 years or so. It's called, the acronym is USBIG. It's United States Basic Income Guarantee. They have annual meetings every spring, usually in February. It's relatively small, but big enough to maintain conferences. And I've met a number of interesting people. There's one version of basic income that exists in one part of the US in a it's not a rudimentary form, but it's not the full-fledged form, obviously, and that's the Alaska Permanent Fund, which means that basically every individual at the end of a year gets a certain amount, that's a percentage, the equivalent percentage of the dividends that are accrued from the fund, that is somewhere around $300 billion at this point. And so basically every Alaskan resident at the end of the year, regardless of age, nationality, ethnic background, etc., gets a check. And so for a family of 4, for example, that means $8,000 or so tax-free at the end of the year. And this has been going on since the 1970s. I met the guy who created it, who was a guy from, ironically, upstate New York, who at some point moved to Alaska and became the mayor of a small town, and created this kind of a fund for his small town because he was frustrated with the lack of funds for socially oriented expenditures. And so the proposal he made, and this is essentially like this, with an idea that Tom Paine formulated in his book on agrarian justice, that those who profit from the use of the land have to pay a certain percentage of the profits they make of the use of the land into a collective fund that can be drawn on to finance socially beneficial investments. And this is something that Paine was a proponent of basic income, an earlier form of basic income. That Paine came up in the 1890s, and this guy, I don't remember his name, who was initially the mayor of a small town, a coastal town in Alaska, and later the governor, came up with the same idea and was able to build the swimming pool for the town and stuff like that. Within three years or so, the fund was big enough to finance that kind of stuff. They just directly could pay it, didn't have to take out any loans. And so when he became the governor in the second half of the 70s, he made the same proposal, and I don't remember when exactly was the Exxon Valdez accident. Does anyone know?
I thought that was in the 80s.
Was it 80s?
I think it's 80s, yeah.
I'm not sure whether it was directly connected to that or to an earlier accident. It was connected to an accident, and he essentially proposed a law to the legislature according to which all oil companies have to pay 1% of their profits into the Alaska Permanent Fund to make up for the fact that they basically get for free resources that really belong to Alaska and should belong to the inhabitants of Alaska, since who owns Alaska, that they are allowed to get the oil out of Alaska without really having to pay much. They get all sorts of tax benefits, etc. And so the proposal of the law was that they had to pay 1% of their profits, also to make up for the mess they create. So whenever there was an accident like the Exxon Valdez, who pays for that? It's taxpayers, obviously, for the cleanup, etc., and for the direct and indirect consequences. I mean, Exxon had to pay for it too, but there's significantly more that has to be paid in order for a decent job to be done. And so it started accruing at that point. And so since the beginning of this century, the amount has been quite substantial. So I mean, it's basically been around, at least around $1,000. Occasionally it's more. Like 2 years ago or so, it was ironically 2 years ago, 2009, after the crisis, it was something like $2,400 per person, which is quite a bit for a family. And what's also interesting is that during the 1990s, era of the internet boom and the beginning of globalization, etc., when inequality in all states, all the states in the union went up significantly. In Alaska, it either went down or essentially remained stable. And so Alaska actually became a at least relatively speaking, possibly absolutely speaking, more egalitarian state during the time when inequality became a serious problem during the last decade of the previous century. So to ascribe that to the basic income, to this Alaska Permanent Fund, would be inappropriate, obviously. It had much more to do with the fact that Alaska was essentially bypassed by the internet boom, and that globalization didn't really affect Alaska. But these dividends definitely helped in the process. The other society that's pursuing this pretty consistently at this point is Brazil. And they started phasing it in about 7 or 8 years ago under the Lula administration. And they decided not to take chances and apply it to the entire population immediately. They started with, I think initially the first phase was people 70 and older. And so the next phase was already, I don't know, I haven't looked into it in a while, 65 and older, etc. And so that the economy has the opportunity to adjust to the changes that result from this. And I mean, in parts of Brazil, inequality, of course, is huge, like in Rio de Janeiro, etc. And I actually met at one of these conferences a few years back the person who in Brazil was responsible for the legislation that the Lula administration successfully passed. This guy is Eduardo Suplicy, who's not sure whether he still is a senator, but he was a senator, had been a senator for some time, in the same party that Lula belongs to. So it's interesting stuff. And then in relation to Iraq, after the mission accomplished in Iraq, there was quite a bit of a debate in the US too. Not just from people who are sort of notorious, not just from people who are notoriously known for advocating basic income, but some people in several agencies in the federal government were suggesting that something similar could actually be pursued in Iraq as well, because Iraq has wealth with the oil. And Iraq had elements of socialism. It was not a capitalist society when the war happened. It was sort of a socialist society. That's how Hussein sustained a sufficient degree of legitimacy to stay in power for such a long time. I mean, they created nice hospitals, etc., etc. And so the suggestion was that it may be that essentially to stabilize the population and this new political system, economic need, concern about poverty, etc., had to be minimized as far as possible, and creating something like basic income based on oil profits would be a possibility. But that didn't go anywhere, of course. And so I mean, there's a whole cloud sense in terms of basic income. The article I sent is from an online journal that you have access to. You can log in as a guest. That was created in 2006, and this was a piece in the first issue in response to an article that sort of ignited, in a sense, the theoretical debate about basic income in the 1980s. And this is this article that's referred to at the beginning, at the top here, A Capitalist Road to Communism. It's published by the leading thinker. He's a philosopher, a Belgian philosopher, on basic income. If you've had a chance to look at the piece, it's Van Parijs. He's published several books on basic income. He's essentially the mouthpiece of the movement, and there are lots of books that have been published over the course of the last 20-25 years on basic income. And the motivation really is to think about a qualitative transformation of the welfare state. I mean, modern democracies cannot work without a welfare state, but the particular welfare state that we have at this point, or the welfare states that we have in different countries at this point, is very much a product of a particular historical window, so to speak. And that window has closed, other windows have opened. And so if we want to secure the future of democracy, it's sort of a simple way of closing this whole thing up, if you want to secure the future of democracy, we have to create a different relationship between capitalist economies and the social support systems that democratic societies provide at the same time. And I mean, that's one aspect of the debate about the crisis that's been going on for the last 3 years that rarely actually enters the picture. The welfare state is it's not part of the discussion, which is kind of ironic. But in Europe, for example, if the EU is to survive, and I said this in class last week, it's not clear whether that's the case. If it is to survive, it will have to, I mean, there's just no way around it, it will have to create a constellation between business and social security that at this point doesn't exist anywhere. And the elites in Europe so far, I think, they don't have the imagination. They simply don't, they're technocrats largely, to actually think along those lines. There's a consequence of that. We are in the situation that we are now with Greece. I don't know whether you saw the newest news that was released this morning. So I mean, the EU basically, or the Euro countries have come up with a proposal whose purpose it is to stabilize the situation and to save Greece. And I mean, this was a lot of work, and it will require more work that will go into 2012. Yesterday, the Greek Prime Minister announced that he would schedule a referendum for the Greek people to decide whether they want to adapt this or not. And the stock markets have gone down globally as a consequence of that. This has caused, I mean, he didn't tell anyone, not even his finance secretary. I mean, it has caused huge frustration. In Europe, especially, several of the Euro countries now are essentially advocating that Greece should be thrown out. Greece should be thrown out. Because
it would have been interesting if Obama had said when we did the TARP fund,
right.
we said we should have a referendum.
Right. Right. And so I mean, it's possible that the majority of the Greeks would support it, but what it means is that basically the very serious people, as Krugman calls them in Europe, the people who are in charge, will have to continue to negotiate a treaty whose purpose it is to save the Greek economy. This will take at least another 4 or 5 months, and at that point they cannot actually assume that this will be adopted by the Greek government, because it will be up to a referendum. And as far as I'm concerned, what this means is that this whole attempt to save the EU or the Eurozone economically has failed. I mean, I can't imagine that. I mean, this may take a few days for people to swallow it, but basically the negotiations that still would have to take place won't actually take place, because it's not guaranteed that this actually will be accepted. And so, I mean, if you look at it motivationally, the people have been working a lot of hours. That's an understatement. The people who have been trying to put this rescue package together, for them to be motivated to do this for another 5 or 6 months, and for it then to be rejected, I mean, the fact that contingency is even there probably means that this process is not going to continue much longer. The first reaction of the Finnish, I'm not sure whether it was the Finnish Prime Minister or the Finnish Secretary of Finance, but his reaction was, okay, as I said, we have to get Greece out of the Eurozone. And I'm sure this is probably going to become worse in the next few days.
No, I was just playing with my beard.
Oh, okay.
That was my hand up.
Well, I had one question, except I kind of promised people a half a class, but a half class would give us a full
Sorry.
class. No, that's fine. I think 3/4 of the room is familiar by now with your ability to extend it, and I think you've.
My inability to be short.
There's that too. And I'm going to ask one question, and then I'll let others ask questions too. But even though I told someone I'd be back by 3, so I lied.
Me too.
I'm just curious. You started with German history as framing. You biographically and your education, and then I'm thinking about, the challenges of getting something like basic income off the ground in either Germany or the United States, and just wondering how much you think. I have a kind of a series of questions. One is sort of how much your experience and the new requirements of education about the Nazi history and the social democracy that came in, these sort of formative moments, affected your sociological imagination of both what is possible and what is, sort of the nightmares in which that can be imagined, which I think the German history, America, if we're categorized in one of the 3 groups you categorized before, are in the middle group that want to shut it off and don't want to think about the nightmares that could happen. And then more broadly, I'm wondering sort of whether you think, as societies, whether Germany or America has more, or whether the question one can ask, whether society has more capacity somehow for sociological imagination in a way that that isn't social Darwinist, which is so dominant here. The sort of formative assumptions of sociology that we live in a society that is a collective that doesn't tolerate exclusion of 10% of the population or 30% for certain things or whatever it is.
Right. Another example would have been that's sort of similar. Basically, the non-acceptability of the death penalty across Europe. And there's a whole set of, I mentioned this last week, 25,000 regulations that every country that wants to become part of the EU has to adopt in addition to their own legal systems, and the exclusion of the death penalty is one. I mean, so that would be an interesting hook too. I mean, how is in one network state, and Europe is one kind of network state, the US is another network state, how can there be this kind of a discrepancy in true context? I mean, what are the social foundations for that? How is it being sustained? How come that there is overwhelming support for the rejection of the death penalty in Europe? Well, here I don't know how overwhelmingly it's in support of it. It's definitely more than 50%.
Yeah.
I mean, where does that come from? I mean, I didn't stop here.
No, that's about where I was. I mean, I could say more, but I'm just sort of curious whether you think about it in terms of sort of the, especially now having taught recently in both places, sort of the openness due to histories and cultures and position within the global economy to thinking sociologically.
Right. That's a pretty hefty question, of course, a set of questions. I mean, sort of a focused way of responding to it would be to say that what you described is probably the reason why I like to use this phrase of necessary preconditions. That in order for certain things to be possible in a particular society, in order for qualitative change to be possible, in order for legislative change to be possible, etc., in order for progress really to happen, the necessary preconditions have to be in place first. And I mean, one of the things I learned, so to speak, as someone who's been teaching theory for almost 20 years now, compared to my expectations of what it would be like before I started teaching it and actively publishing in theory, etc., is that for us as social scientists, the emphasis on necessary preconditions is far more important than the emphasis on on shooting directly for results, so to speak. So if we, for example, if you want to, this is an area in the department, if you want to make sort of rescuing the environment is probably a better term these days than protecting the environment. If you want to make rescuing the environment, sort of dampening global warming, etc., a possibility, then those are not goals that can be achieved directly by political means if the necessary preconditions are not in place. So if people, for example, don't really have the ability to cognitively relate to what environment actually means, how important it is for our lives, etc., then if for most people it's sort of a placeholder that doesn't really have any meaning or gravity or significance, then passing legislation that might be costly and would be conducive to doing some good things, put it simply, with regard to the environment is extremely difficult, if possible at all. And so as social scientists, I mean, this is just trying to compress it.
Yeah.
As social scientists, our responsibility may have more to do with figuring out what kinds of goals are achievable in terms of them constituting necessary preconditions for something else than to be pursued much more effectively. So that on the one hand, we need to obviously work with scenarios. Positive and negative scenarios. This is definitely a time when negative scenarios are significantly more close to home than in positive scenarios. I had a conversation with Eric this summer when he visited. He's a student who went to Cambridge. And we had a conversation about what was going on politically and socially, culturally, and so forth. And at some point I asked him, I mean, he's not quite 20 years younger than me, but you're quite a bit younger than me. Do you see any basis from which to assume that things over the course of the next 20, 30 years will get significantly better? So he was kind of leaning back and thinking about it and rocking a bit. He said, nah, not really. And so we are not really in a position to formulate some positive goals and to shoot for them directly. If we try to do that, we basically just remain where we are. I mean, this is me speaking sort of from my biographical experience. What we need to do is recognize, on the one hand, how established ways of doing things, existing institutions, and particular societies at certain times represent impediments for doing things that clearly would be beneficial to the collectivity, so to speak, in whose interests those institutions are supposed to work, etc. So as sociologists, let me see, I just had a better formulation. Let me see whether I can capture it again. I mean, as sociologists or social scientists, our responsibility in part is clearly to recognize how actually existing societies today, at the same time present certain opportunities, but also a lot of impediments. Societies and elites that represent the societies really have no interest in recognizing those. They are much more interested in working with those, in using those to work the public, to manipulate the public, to make sure that they remain the elites, to essentially extract as much benefits from their position. So if we as social scientists buy into the priorities of the elites, then we too overlook how existing frameworks, existing ways of organizing societies, existing ways of doing things are not likely to, how certain ones, so specificity is important here, how they are not conducive to achieving stated goals, how they are impediments to stating those goals. And so as social scientists, we have to basically be aware of the fact that that is the case. We have to recognize it. We have to understand how these impediments work, how attempts to bring about certain changes are thwarted by the way we're doing things, by assumptions about how things ought to be done, by procedures that institutions represent, etc. And then in the second step, think about ways of formulating this, verbalizing this, communicating this potentially to a larger audience that actually might resonate in some form. So I mean, goal-directed action is not very likely to succeed in the present context in particular. And that's part of the contradictory nature of modern society. Whatever we do, the result will be something else. So we want to go there, but we end up over there, or we might end up over there, etc. That's how our societies are structured. And so if we don't recognize that that is the case, then we are participants in those kinds of patterns. And so for us not to participate in being sort of pillars for those patterns, we have to recognize them for what they are. And then, I mean, essentially, this is something I thought about before. I assumed that if you recognize something, if you understand how societies work well, then a lot of people should be interested in finding out about that. One of the things I realized that that's clearly not the case. The opposite is the case. So the more you understand, the less people are interested in figuring out what you understood. So one of our responsibilities is to frame it in a way in which we can teach, in a sense, teach people something they, as representatives of existing societies, don't really want to find out about. And so how we communicate our insights is extremely important. And there's no way of predicting whether that will work or not. It's crapshot, basically. It's constant. What we can do is start trial balloons, and hopefully one of the trial balloons at some point works. Maybe a set of them will work, and things actually will turn out in ways that are consistent with stated goals. That's pretty much it. If anyone's interested in this whole nexus of problems with necessary preconditions and stated goals, and the construction and pursuit and implementation of social policies, there's one chapter I published a few years ago that deals with this very quite directly, and I think I might reference it in here. Yeah, it's the one piece that's referenced, the second one that's referenced by me. It's a longer piece on globalization, alienation, and basic income. And so there's some nice formulations in there. And one of them is, what's the purpose of social policy? It's to police those who suffer from social inequalities, not to solve their problems. So the purpose of social policy is not to solve problems, but to police those who suffer from those problems. A few statements like that.
You fix the blame, not
Thanks.
the problem.
Huh?
You fix the blame, not the problem.
Anything else? Harry said he's willing to stay here till 6 tomorrow morning. So we're not as young as we used to be, but we have been
We are
on
not
to exchange emails at odd hours. So I'm not sure whether Harry's waking up or going to sleep. So any other questions, discussion points? 3/4 of you get your chance to try to interrupt Harry once a week. So he's stopped talking for a minute. Here's your chance.
I was supposed to shut up an hour ago, wasn't I?
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming in.
Cool. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.